The last time The last time I stood before you and delivered a sermon was in October of last year. And I told you then that I was beginning part one of a two-part series, and you laughed because you thought I was kidding. I told you then I was going to pick up part two next summer. Well, it's next summer, and I wasn't lying. This is part two of that series. I spoke to you back in October about how fear is just a motivator, that we experience the emotion of fear, but we have choices about what we do with it. To avoid rehashing the entire sermon, I can make that point by telling you one quick story that will be an example of what it is I'm talking about. When I was young, we lived in an apartment complex. One Saturday afternoon, I went outside to do what young men do in apartment complexes, to throw a baseball with a friend. Now, we didn't have a bat because you can't control where a ball goes, but we were pretty close to expert level at throwing and catching, so we figured we were fine. I don't remember, and I mean this, I don't remember who threw it, and I don't remember who didn't catch it, but I do remember the sound of the window breaking. We were in a courtyard, we broke the window, and then Adam, his name was Adam, we locked eyes, and we both experienced fear, and in that moment, we had a choice to make. What do? Do we stand and do we confess our crime, or do we do what most kids do and we run, which is what we did. We ran back into the apartment, we shut the door, we turned off the lights, we went to the window, and we peeked outside to see what was going to happen next. I remember the people who lived in the apartment coming out, holding the baseball, looking really confused. And then I remember, this is when things got interesting. The apartment manager came showed up to the scene of the crime, and then she started pointing like this. Cameras. Oh, things got very real at that point. So she's pointing at the cameras. So now Adam and I are in the apartment with thinking we pulled off the perfect crime, and now we have a whole new fear. Okay, is it going to be worse to go outside and confess our crime, or would it be worse to stay inside and be caught on tape? After a lot of back and forth, which side of that argument I was on is not relevant. After a lot of back and forth, we decided that it was safer to go outside and confess our crime. Now, if you are like me and grew up in a home where there were consequences for your actions, you can relate to the fear that we experienced inside that apartment as we debated what to do. Because you're probably thinking, if I had done that and my dad knew that I broke a window and then ran, I'd be in trouble. Me too. But my parents were the least of my concerns. In fact, they didn't even cross my mind. The reason, they lived 1,000 miles away. I was 22 when this happened. Adam, who I just described, is now a deacon at McDermott Road. And at one point in our back and forth, one of us made the statement, "Dude, it's cool. They'll never suspect the youth minister and the financial planner." Again, we thought we had pulled off the perfect crime. The idea in that story is that we had a lot of choices that we could make. Fear motivated us to run from the courtyard. Fear motivated us back in to the apartment. Fear motivated us out of the apartment. The idea that I wanted you to get is that fear is just a motivator, and the question we have to ask ourselves is what we're going to do with it. We don't have to be victims of fear. Back in October, we looked at Matthew chapter 14. We looked at Jesus and Peter walking on water, and we talked then about how focusing on Jesus when the waves of life are the biggest is the most important thing that we can do. But that was back in October. I had no idea back in October what was going to happen over the course of the next few months. Back in October, the storms of life that we were living through were a patchy drizzle compared to what was coming. The spring showers of 2020 came in hard and fast, and for many of us, before we knew it, we were underwater. And in the midst of all of it, in the midst of all the chaos, the panic, the social unrest, all the things that we were experiencing, we had the chair kicked out from underneath us. Our church family. We were no longer able to meet and to connect with each other in the way that we were used to. There are a lot of you like me who get your weekly recharge from being together as God's family. That's true of my family. A couple of weeks ago, we walked in the door on a Sunday morning, and my wife caught eyes with Becky McGee, and she hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks, and so they ran to each other and hugged and did the lady sway when they hug. I, of course, stood in the back and pointed and ratted them out. We got inside after that little exchange, and we sat down, and my wife leaned over to me, and she said, "I'm really sorry." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "I know I wasn't supposed to go hug her like that." Yeah, true, but I could not have imagined a period of time where we would be apologizing to each other for hugging at church. It seems crazy. I know that you miss seeing each other's maskless faces. This is a very bizarre sight to me, to look out and see a bunch of masked faces. I know that you miss your classes. I know that your kids miss their classes. I know that you miss Wednesday nights because Wednesday nights felt like a family get-together. I know for my family that was absolutely true. Wednesday night was our favorite time of the week. We'd get here for the meal. We would eat while the kids ran off and played. It was one of the few meals during the week where April and I got to eat with other adults and have adult conversation. And then class would start, and we would enjoy that time together, and then we would hang out until everybody else was gone because we just didn't want to leave. My kids miss Wednesday nights because Wednesday nights they did not have a bedtime. That is not the case anymore. In a moment where we needed the safety and we needed the comfort of our church family, it wasn't there. At least it wasn't there in the way that we were used to. There are a lot of emotions in that reality. There's pain, there's confusion. For many of us, we feel as though for the last few months we've been mourning a loss. Even as we make plans to begin reconnecting, we make plans to begin coming together in new and unique ways, but even in that, we're still mourning a loss for what once was. There is hurt, there is dread, and I dare say there is an awful lot of fear. What do we do now? What happens next? When will it end? Will it end? These are all questions we're asking right now. We've had tragedies that have struck our culture plenty of times before, but you'd have to go back a long ways to find anything close to what's happening now. Something that stretched its tentacles into our daily lives. Everything is different now. There's not a single person within the sound of my voice or in this room whose life is not different today than it was a few months ago. And every person in this room, regardless of your age, regardless of your life status, regardless of where you are in your walk, every person in this room in the last few months has wrestled on some level with fear. And fear, at its core, is about a loss of control. Now, yours may look different than the person sitting next to you, but fear at its core is about a loss of control. It's the reason that some people are deathly afraid of flying, but not afraid of driving in a car. Statistically, car rides are exponentially more dangerous, but in a car, you feel like you're in control. So that fear level doesn't rise. Whereas in a plane, you're just kind of at the mercy. You're sitting in a seat at the mercy of things you don't understand and people that you can't see. And that's what creates that fear. Fear is about a loss of control. If you'll stay with me this morning, I think you'll see that fear is at the root of our world right now. We're going to talk a bit this morning about how to spot yours, and then my hope is to give you some encouragement for what to do with your fear when you do experience it. We're going to be this morning in the book of Daniel. If you want to turn to Daniel, I think you'll find some things there that will be a benefit to you. This morning we're picking up in Daniel. It's not a continuation of Jason's series, Jason's one continuous story series, but this is where he left off last week, so it fit really well to go to this text this morning. Specifically, though, I want to focus on one of the people that we find in the book of Daniel who doesn't get the kind of sermon time that I think he should. The guy who is overshadowed by the flannel graph-friendly VBS heroes that we find in the book of Daniel. Today, I want to focus exclusively on King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is a fascinating figure to me in the book of Daniel. To give you some context, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with who King Nebuchadnezzar is, he is the Babylonian king when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are all taken captive. Politically, he's all-powerful. So in the Babylonian king in his time, he was politically all-powerful. He is not the king who throws Daniel into the lion's den. That's Darius. But he is the king who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace. So now that you're with me, that's who we're talking about this morning. He is generally looked at in this book as a side note. We've got heroes. We've got VBS flannel graph heroes, and he's not one of them. So he doesn't get to go on the flannel graph. But to me, he's absolutely fascinating. He's a king, but he's not stable. And in fact, he's the definition of unstable. Throughout this book, he is all over the map. He responds to everything that happens in as extreme a way as possible. And responding to everything in extremes is a sign of instability. You ever met somebody and thought to yourself, man, you got to tone it down a notch? And I smile because I think of how many people are thinking, yeah, you. That's not what I mean. I don't just mean people who talk fast, but who are otherwise a delight and enjoyable. No, I'm talking about people whose responses to things that happen in their life are always extreme responses. We have something that takes place, and their responses can be extreme in the positive and extreme in the negative. These are people who you probably don't say anything critical to because you're afraid they're going to explode and then never speak to you again. These are the types of people who seem like, depending on the day, the season, the weather, and what your last text message said, they're either your best friend or your mortal enemy. That's kind of who I'm talking about. Nebuchadnezzar has that kind of a personality. He's driven by his emotions, and he responds to every circumstance in this book in the most extreme manner possible. I'm going to give you a couple of examples leading into where we're going to look textually this morning. I'm going to give you a couple of examples in the book of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar responds in an extreme way. He has a nightmare in chapter 2. He demands that it be interpreted by his wise men, but he won't tell the wise men what the nightmare was. And then when they can't interpret it, he gets so angry, he decides to have all of the wise men of Babylon executed. That's an extreme response. Nebuchadnezzar makes an idol to himself and then threatens death to anyone who doesn't bow to it. Again, that is an extreme response. Before he throws Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace for not bowing to the idol, he gets so angry with them that he orders the furnace turned up 7 times hotter than normal. Again, that is an extreme response. God saves the boys that he has just attempted to execute. Nebuchadnezzar recognizes the miracle that God has just performed, and even his response to that is extreme. So he's just watched God's hand protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his response to that is he makes a decree that anyone who says anything bad against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and their house in ruins. Again, that's an extreme response. So even when he's trying to be nice, even when he's trying to be supportive, it's an extreme response. There's a phrase that I use a lot in clinical moments with people. And the phrase is, love your passion, but your process could use some work. I see that in this particular moment with Nebuchadnezzar. I love your passion, but your process could use some work. This is not a stable person. This is not a stable, emotionally stable human being. Nebuchadnezzar is the victim of his emotions. He's led around by them, and he never seems to recognize them, and he certainly never seems to challenge those emotions. Now, I want to be more specific. This is just my interpretation. So I am open to the possibility that I'm way off. But when I read the book of Daniel and I read the interactions in Nebuchadnezzar, I see a man who is crippled by the fear of what other people will think of him. I believe Nebuchadnezzar is afraid of looking weak. I believe that is a trait that is common amongst politically powerful people. And I certainly believe that that trait was true of Nebuchadnezzar. He's terrified of what other people are going to think of him. We generally look at his story and we only see pride. And that's certainly true. He is a shining example of how pride can lead us into destruction. Pride is the most obvious issue that I believe he struggles with. I think it's spelled out for us in Scripture. But what is pride? Placing a very high emphasis on the opinions of other people and then reveling in the fact that you're outpacing them is where pride comes from. Pride can't exist unless how you compare to others is incredibly important to you personally. At its core, pride is the outward projection of inner fear. It's either that you don't measure up or that you do measure up and you fear losing that status, so you have to wear it like a badge and swing it like a sword. Nebuchadnezzar, to me, appears to be incredibly fearful throughout the book of Daniel. His actions reveal fear. I want to give you an example of what I mean when I say his actions reveal fear. Before he attempts to execute Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he gives them a second chance. The incident that's taken place, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down. King Nebuchadnezzar is told, and rather than executing them on the spot, he gives them a second chance. He says, okay, if you're ready now we're going to try this again. So he gives them a second chance. Why would he do that? That makes no sense in terms of an all-powerful ruler. If he were only motivated by pride, if he were only motivated by being amazing and being awesome, wouldn't you want to execute somebody the first chance you get, the first time somebody steps over the line and breaks a rule that you've instituted? Wouldn't you want to execute them immediately on the spot? He doesn't do that. Why? Why doesn't he? I think the fact that he gives them a second chance, and it's speculation on my part, I admit, but it suggests that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to execute these young men. So again, we have to ask the question, then why did he? I believe, and it is just my opinion, but I believe that he was afraid. I believe that if he didn't, he would look weak, and if he looked weak, his entire kingdom would be in jeopardy. And for us men, especially men who need to feel strong, fear often dresses up in an anger costume so that nobody will recognize it. I think that's true for a lot of us. I see it in Nebuchadnezzar. When I read Daniel, I see Nebuchadnezzar being controlled by debilitating fear of losing what he values most and a fear of what other people will think of him. Those are two things that I think we're all struggling with today. I'll shed some light on it more in a minute, but I want to repeat what I just said. He's fearful of losing what he values most, and he is fearful of what other people think of him, and those are two things that I believe we are struggling with today. For those reasons, Daniel 4 is one of my personal favorite books of the Bible. It's the story of a powerful, unstable king who is controlled by fear, being changed from the inside by God, and as an added bonus, there's a diagnosable mental disorder in it. So you can see why I'm drawn to Daniel 4. I'll set the stage. Nebuchadnezzar again has a dream that scares him, and he again turns to Daniel to interpret it. Daniel explains to him that the meaning of his dream is that God is about to take his kingdom from him, and that is exactly what happens. And it is not pretty. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is stripped away from him. He's made to believe that he is an ox in a field, and he lives like one. I'm going to read from Daniel 4. I'm going to begin in verse 33. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. It's like the description of all of us coming out of those first 3 months of Corona. Nebuchadnezzar seems to me throughout this book to be driven by his emotions, specifically fear. That fear leads him to a debilitating pride. To truly reach him, God makes him confront that fear head on, and he does it by taking away everything and making Nebuchadnezzar's fear a reality. Here's the thing about Daniel 4, and here's the thing about this particular moment in Scripture. I think we remove ourselves from this story a bit too much. What I mean by that is, I think we sometimes miss the power of this moment in Daniel, largely because we don't see ourselves in it. And I don't think we see ourselves in it for two reasons. One, I don't think we see ourselves in it because in this book, we don't want to connect to Nebuchadnezzar's story. We want to connect to the heroes. None of us view ourselves through the lens that would cause us to connect to Nebuchadnezzar. We all want to be the good guys. We view ourselves that way, so that's when we read Daniel, we focus on Daniel. We focus on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So chapter 4 gets left off the flannel graph entirely because they're not in this one. So we don't connect to this because we see ourselves as the good guys and we only connect to the good guys. The bad guys are just there to be the antagonist. Now, I think we need to be cautious anytime we categorize good and bad. I think that limits the way we view things, and I think this is one of those moments. We put Nebuchadnezzar into the antagonist category, which means his story, his experience, doesn't really apply to us. We'll use it every now and then for a conversation about pride and making sure that we don't carry ourselves with pride, but we don't really connect to his story. I also think we disconnect from it because we don't think we can relate to the details. I want to explain what I mean. We read Nebuchadnezzar's story. We read of a man being made to believe that he was a cow, eating in a field like one, and we think, well, that's crazy. He thought he was a cow. I've never thought I was a cow. Never even thought I was a goat. I'm probably fine. And then we disconnect from it because those details, those specifics, we can't relate to. I want to see if we can look at verse 33. I'm going to paraphrase what we just read and what you just saw in verse 33 to see if it applies to us. In order to change Nebuchadnezzar's heart, in order to get the attention of a fearful, unstable man, God struck him with a mental illness. That hits a little closer to home to us. Now, his particular mental illness was something called boanthropy. I told you there's a diagnosable mental health disorder in here. Boanthropy is the condition, the psychological condition where a person believes themselves to be an ox and eats grass in a field. You can still find cases of this now. But to get his attention, to get Nebuchadnezzar's attention, he is struck with a mental illness. And beginning in verse 34, which is what you see in front of you, we get a beautiful picture of a changed heart. In it, Nebuchadnezzar praises God. In it, he seems to be worshiping. His fear seems to be gone. So I want to try to connect to Nebuchadnezzar just a bit. He was prideful and fearful, but at the end of this chapter, he appears to be truly confessing the one true God. To get him here, God brought to life Nebuchadnezzar's greatest fear, that he would look weak and that he would look vulnerable, and he would lose the everyday kingdom that he had created for himself. To get him here, to get him to a place of humility, to get him to a place of reason, God struck him with a mental illness and took away everything he knew. Only in that could Nebuchadnezzar free himself of the fear that wrecked his life. I don't know about you, but that hits a little closer to home to me. A lot of the things that we once feared losing, on some level, we've recently lost. Depression and anxiety are two of the most prominent mental health diagnoses in the field. That was true 5 months ago. It's even more true now. The vast majority of us have struggled over the past 5 months with something. Maybe depression, maybe anxiety, maybe insomnia, maybe a substance abuse relapse, maybe a marriage that's breaking under the crumbled weight of the moment that we're in, and we've all struggled, at least on some level, with fear. I have no doubt that all of the issues I just rattled off exist in this room right now. Now, I want to be clear. I don't know God's plans. I don't know your life story or any of the other hundreds of factors that go into your situation. So please don't hear me saying that God has cursed us all in order to strengthen our faith. But I can tell you that if you're struggling with anything that I just said, asking yourself how you can grow from this experience, what lessons God may have for you in this experience, can be a life-changing question for us to begin asking. Nebuchadnezzar was given the gift of a mental health disorder in order to save his soul. He was given the gift of a mental health disorder in order to save his soul. And in the process of his awakening, his kingdom was returned to him, and it all started in verse 34, when his eyes were lifted to heaven. That's the verse you see in front of you. I want to read together. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. This verse is beautiful. It's instructional. Nebuchadnezzar was a man who didn't want to look weak. Daniel 4 tells us in great detail about the specifics of his mental illness. It gives us graphic and embarrassing details of that mental illness. You could make the case, you could easily make the case that Nebuchadnezzar would have wanted to keep these details as quiet as possible, which makes the first-person language throughout the chapter in Daniel 4 so interesting to me. I want you to pay attention to the first-person language beginning in verse 1. I'll read for you. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show you the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. He then goes on to tell the story that we just explored. This unique chapter in Daniel is the testimony of a powerful, prideful, fearful Gentile king and how God changed his heart, warts and all. And it's addressed to everyone on the planet. This king, who had been consumed by what others thought of him, is now screaming his darkest moments from the mountaintop because those dark moments glorify God. And he's conquered his fear. So the question that I want to explore with these last few minutes is, what do we do with ours? What are these moments in the book of Daniel? What are these moments in the life of a frightened king? What do these moments teach us about our fear? The first point that I would give you this morning is, if we're going to manage our fear, you can go ahead and, there we go. If we're going to manage our fear, I think we need to start by recognizing what it is that we're afraid of. I think we need to identify our fears. I think that's one of the many places where Nebuchadnezzar went wrong in his experience of being fearful. Had I been the royal therapist, which would have been a weird job, but I would have loved it. If I'd been the royal therapist, I would have tried to get him to say out loud that he was fearful of how he was being perceived and that he was fearful of losing his kingdom. Because saying out loud what underlying fear or dread you're carrying is a vital step in conquering it. Here's the thing about fear. Fear and anxiety look similar in a lot of ways. It's right behind you all the time. It follows you around, so you move faster, thinking that the faster you move, the less likely it is to catch you. If you can relate to that picture, I want to encourage you this morning to stop running, turn around, and look that monster dead in the eye and describe it. That's what the therapeutic process is, really. It's what we do. We get you to look at your fear and say it out loud. You know what happens when we say our fears out loud, when we describe them in great detail? It doesn't look as scary. Things don't look nearly as scary when you talk through them in great detail. What do I mean? Are you feeling fear this morning? Are you feeling anxiety? Are you feeling stress? I want to encourage you this morning to say out loud what it is that you are afraid of. Be specific. Be personal. Don't just say, the culture is disintegrating. Talk really intentionally about what that means and why that matters to you so much. Don't just say, the virus, I'm afraid of the virus. Talk about personally how it affects you, personally how you've seen the world change and what you're personally afraid of. Saying it out loud is vital because it's hard to fight a monster that you won't look at. For the record, there's also some science to saying our fear out loud. I'll give you the short version of this. Things that we experience, things that we think, that we don't say out loud, they reside in the creative hemisphere of our brain. And while they're sitting in that creative hemisphere of our brain does an amazing job of adding stuff to it. Our brains make scary things look scarier. They make dark things look darker. They make anxieties and fears more anxiety-inducing and more fear-inducing. That happens in the creative hemisphere of our brain. We don't want to say them out loud because we're afraid of how we're going to be perceived. We're afraid that our spouse isn't going to understand, or we're afraid that if we do say them out loud, we're going to look crazy, or we're going to unburden, or we're going to burden the person that we're talking to. So we keep our fears, we keep our anxieties hidden in the creative hemisphere of our brain where they grow and color is added to them. By virtue of saying them out loud, if you do nothing else. So nobody offers you help, nobody offers you a suggestion. By virtue of saying them out loud, you have to activate the concrete, logical part of your brain, which allows those emotions to level out. It's kind of a DIY therapy, but just so you're aware, things that we keep inside get worse. Things that we say out loud get better. And if you don't know exactly what you're afraid of, if you can't articulate it, then how will you know when there's nothing to fear? If you can't say out loud what you're afraid of, how do you know when it's okay to stop being scared? Dr. Sam Young survived the Galveston hurricane of 1900 that completely destroyed the city of Galveston. His house was at the corner of Bath and Avenue P on Galveston Island. He watched the storm roll in from a rocking chair on the second floor of his home. He saw the rain coming in. He saw the wind coming in. He kept a journal of what he saw. He nodded off. He fell asleep into the night when the rain was heavy and there was flooding out on the street, but things didn't look too bad. And he woke up in the middle of the night, pitch black, and he heard a thumping sound on his floor, and that's what woke him up. He said the first thing that he noticed when he woke up was sitting on top of his stairwell was what appeared to be a dark mirror, which he thought was odd. As his mind caught up, he realized that the mirror he was seeing at the top of his stairwell was seawater, and that the thumping sound that he was hearing was his furniture on the first floor floating in the floodwater and smacking against the floor. He walked to his balcony door, he opened it, and he said it looked like he was in a ship lost at sea. Nothing but ocean, nothing but dark ocean that was only illuminated by lightning flashes. Where there had once been streets, there was only ocean. Where there had once been houses, there was only ocean. His was the only house that was still standing. He was on the second floor balcony looking out into a dark, dark sea, and at that point he did the only thing that he could think to do. He grabbed a door, he waited for his house to give way, and as soon as it did, he pulled that door off and he floated on it. He used it as a raft, and as the house gave way, he kicked away from the house. He floated on that door for hours, having no clue whether he was being taken out to sea or whether he was coming back in towards land. Eventually, after hours and hours and hours of floating with no real clue where he was going, he eventually ran smack into the top floor of an orphanage that had not been taken by the floodwaters. He managed to climb onto the roof of the orphanage, climb into a window, and hide there until the water receded. I read that story not that long ago, and I remember thinking, that is the scariest visual I've ever had in my life. I just told that story to my wife the day I read it, and it gave her a nightmare. That is one of the scariest mental pictures I can possibly imagine, but here's the part that was crazy. Throughout the entire ordeal, Dr. Young says he never felt a second of fear. If you just see that sentence, you'd be tempted to either call him a liar or say he's delusional. But when you get his explanation, I believe it makes sense. When asked how he could go through something like that and not experience a moment of fear, his answer was, because my wife and children were safe in San Antonio. The thing that he feared most was an impossibility, so he was at peace. He knew what he feared most, so even in the midst of an otherwise terrifying situation, he was at peace, because that thing that he truly feared most wasn't in jeopardy. I think that same thing can be true for us as well, and we'll go back to what that means here in just a minute. The things that we fear most in this world should not be of this world. The things we should fear most should be eternity things, salvation things. And I'm here to encourage you this morning, folks, those things are safe with the Father in heaven. You can exhale a bit this morning. So my first advice to you this morning is to say your fears out loud. Next, I want you to learn from Nebuchadnezzar's weakness. Recognize that we are way more prone to fearing what people will think about us than we realize that we are. So we need to identify that the fear of how others perceive us is something that many of us struggle with without recognizing it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Not me. I couldn't care less what people think about me. Maybe, but maybe not. I want to tell you a few of the ways that I see this, fear of how others are perceiving us, a few of the ways in which I see this playing out in our world right now. Tell me if you connect to any of the things that I say here. I see people who don't want people to know just how scared they are of this virus. I see people who don't want people to know just how little they're scared of this virus. I see hardworking people in this congregation afraid to tell people that they've lost their job or that they've lost half of their income. They're afraid to ask for help, even from their church family, because they just don't want people to know. I see people afraid to admit that their marriage is struggling. One of the reasons that they are afraid to admit that is because for years they've been posting on Facebook about how great it is. I see people afraid to admit that Google says that what they're experiencing is depression. I see people afraid to tell their spouse that their income isn't nearly as steady as you've been letting on. Your job's not as secure, and your financial status isn't at all as healthy. I see people afraid that their family's going to discover they've started drinking again. I see people afraid to admit that God found them at the bottom of a very ugly moment in their life because they're ashamed of that ugly moment. I see people afraid to say that seeing the world spun into utter chaos, as it has been over the last 5 months, has caused them to question everything they believe about God, because the church has inadvertently made that particular struggle seem like something you're not supposed to say out loud. Folks, I think we need to say our fears out loud, and I think we need to admit that too often our fears are rooted in what other people will think of us. I'm speculating on Nebuchadnezzar's root struggle, but we don't have to speculate as to what it looked like. Nebuchadnezzar, a king, screamed from the mountaintops that he had been made to believe that he was livestock, because in that struggle, God was glorified. He didn't care what it made him look like. Many of you within the sound of my voice have stories. God used your lowest moment to turn you back to him. How much more powerful would those moments be if we were more willing to say them out loud? So we have to say out loud what it is that we're afraid of, and we have to admit that many of our fears are rooted in what other people will think of us. But Nebuchadnezzar's story gives us another point, and I think it's the most important point of this entire story. And it is the antidote to fear, and it's what I want you to walk away with today. To conquer your fear, you must lift your eyes to heaven. These are Nebuchadnezzar's words. When he lifted his eyes to heaven, his reason returned to him. Reason. Reason is what often replaces fear. Reason. It's not fearlessness. The ability to understand context, the power of the mind to think, to understand, to form judgments through a process of logic. Reason is the opposite of fear, and it's what needs to replace fear in our lives. So how do we do that? We lift our eyes to heaven. We lift our eyes to heaven. To do that, you're first going to have to lift them off your iPhone. You're also going to have to lift them off your TV screen. Stay informed in the midst of this pandemic, but please don't obsessively consume information in the midst of this pandemic. If you're like me and you pay careful attention to the news, my advice to you this morning is limit your intake. You're not going to miss anything other than the yelling and screaming. So limit your intake and instead lift your eyes to heaven. Pick up your Bible and read through one of the Gospels. When things get really hard, go back to Jesus. I promise you'll feel better. Take Jason's advice. He says it a lot, and he says it a lot for a reason. Read the Psalms. It's hard not to feel better. Read Philippians. It may be the most joyful book in the Bible and was written from a dirty jail cell. Keep that thought in your mind as you're reading it. I promise, lifting your eyes to heaven in that way will make you feel better. My goal for you this morning is I want you to find intentional ways to point your mind back to God. Lift your eyes to heaven. But if you're looking for the most effective way to do this, the most effective way to lift your eyes to heaven, if you were only to do one thing, it would be this. Pray a lot right now. Talk to God. Be intentional. Go to him with your fear. Say your fears out loud. Name it and give it to God. You don't have to know what to pray for. You don't have to ask for anything. My boys are 8 and 4. When they're scared, they come to me or they go to mama. And you know what's interesting? They never have to ask for anything. You know what they do? They cuddle in and they say, I'm scared. That's the extent of what they say to us. And then we take over because we know what to do with their fear. And I imagine most of the parents in the world can relate to that story. If we, as imperfect human beings, know what to do with the fear of our children, how much more does God know what to do with your fear? You don't have to tell God how to fix it. You don't have to give him a drop-down menu of options. Just tell him you're scared. And then listen to the voice of the Lord. Jason finished his sermon last week by saying that the Old Testament prophets could be summarized as, listen to the voice of the Lord. I wrote down in my notes, I wrote those words really, really big because I wanted to finish my sermon this morning in the same way. Listen to the voice of the Lord, not to the voice of fear. The voice of fear ignores all of the hope in the world. The voice of the Lord tells you that he is the hope in this world. The voice of fear finds all the reasons you can't. The voice of the Lord tells you that you can because he can. The voice of fear turns hypotheticals into inevitables. It turns the worst case scenarios into the most likely outcome. The voice of the Lord reminds you that He's in control. Fear seeks division. The Lord provides unity. Fear tells you that if you mess this one up, there's no coming back from it. The Lord tells you, my grace is sufficient. Fear tells you that fear is the most important thing in the world. So every decision you make should be in an attempt to minimize it. The Lord tells you that He is the most important thing in the world, so you don't have to live that way. Fear shackles you to a life whose singular goal is survival. The Lord frees you to a life whose singular outcome is eternity in heaven. Fear tells you that the dangers of this world are so awful that they should be avoided at all cost, up to and including living a joyless life. The Lord tells you that the true dangers in this world are those that threaten the soul, not those that threaten the body. Fear tells you that this country will never be okay again. The Lord tells you His kingdom reigns forever. Something I wanted you to take away today is that fear tells you that you are not in control. And then it convinces you that you should be. The voice of the Lord tells you that you're not in control and then tells you that that's as it should be. It's a powerful reality for us. Fear is a liar. Our God is truth. And so this morning, I want to encourage you to listen to the voice of the Lord and silence the voice of fear in your life. Anytime we gather together, we want to provide an opportunity to meet any special spiritual needs that you may have. If you have a prayer request that you'd like to be made public, if you'd like for us to pray for you, we'd be honored to do so. If that's you, I'd encourage you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.